The moment my daughter quietly slid the deadbolt shut from the other side of the door, I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I simply stood still in the darkness of our wine cellar and listened as her heels tapped across the kitchen floor above us. And the only thought that crossed my mind was this: she has absolutely no idea what she just set in motion. My wife reached for my arm in the dark. Her fingers were cold. They had been cold for months now, ever since her heart began giving her trouble. She held my arm tightly, the kind of grip that asks a question without needing to speak. I leaned closer to her ear and whispered softly, "Don't make a sound. They believe they've already won. They're wrong." She didn't ask what I meant. After 41 years of marriage, Margaret has learned that when I speak in that particular tone, quiet, steady, without even a trace of fear, it means I've already planned several moves ahead. She slowly relaxed her grip, let out a careful breath, and trusted me. That trust is the only inheritance that has ever truly mattered to me. But to understand the rest, you need to understand the house first, because the house is really the center of this entire story. I built it myself. I didn't hire contractors or developers. I built it with my own hands. I poured the foundation in the spring of 1987. Every beam was set by me. Every wire ran through the walls because I placed it there. I even mixed the mortar for the stonework covering the exterior. I was 34 years old at the time and had just taken an early retirement from my career as a structural engineer working for the state of Connecticut. I cashed out a pension that felt enormous to a man who had grown up with almost nothing. Margaret was 31 then, pregnant with our daughter Lily, and we had made a promise to each other that before our child entered this world, she would come home to a house that truly belonged to her family. It took 14 months to finish. Margaret painted every room while I was still hammering and fitting boards into place. We moved in 6 weeks before Lily was born. The house sat on 2.5 acres in a quiet little town in western Connecticut, the sort of place where neighbors waved from their porches and doors stayed unlocked for decades, at least until the world changed and people started locking everything. The house had 4 bedrooms, a sunroom that captured the afternoon light like a greenhouse, and a basement I had designed myself, half storage space and half what I like to call a wine cellar, although during the early years it mostly held canned goods and stacks of old tax returns. Over time, though, the wine cellar slowly became exactly what its name suggested. Margaret discovered a fondness for good Burgundy when she reached her 40s, and I happily encouraged it. By the time Lily left for college, we had built a respectable collection worth storing properly. I installed a climate-controlled rack myself and fitted the room with a thick oak door that had an exterior bolt. The bolt had actually been Margaret's idea. She said it would help keep the temperature stable. I agreed and installed it without much thought. I never once imagined that the same bolt would someday be used against us. Lily had always been what I would politely describe as ambitious, though Margaret, during her more honest moments, preferred the word hungry. Not hungry in the way poor children are hungry. We never let our daughter go without anything. No, this was a different kind of hunger, the kind certain people develop after they've already been given everything and decide it still isn't enough. 11 years ago, she married Brandon Cole. Brandon was a commercial real estate developer from Fairfield County, the kind of man who wore expensive watches, spoke casually about investment zones at dinner, and somehow made you feel like you yourself were just another asset waiting to be developed. I didn't dislike him immediately. That came about 4 months later. They lived in a beautiful house in Westport. They drove beautiful cars. They took luxurious vacations. And yet none of it ever seemed to satisfy them, because the house in Westport carried a mortgage, while the house in western Connecticut, our house, was completely paid off, sitting on 2.5 acres that by 2023 the county assessor valued at just under $1.4 million. I knew exactly what the property was worth. I also noticed the way Brandon began studying that number whenever it came up in conversation. It was the same look a man gives a piece of fruit he intends to take from a bowl that isn't his. It began the way these things usually begin, with something that sounded perfectly reasonable. Brandon called me one Tuesday evening in October, about 8 months before everything finally collapsed, and said he wanted to discuss estate planning. He used phrases like protecting your assets and avoiding probate. He mentioned that a colleague of his, a tax attorney, had helped several of his clients transfer property to their children in ways that saved enormous sums in estate taxes, and he said he would gladly arrange a meeting. I told him I already had an attorney. I'd been working with the same lawyer for nearly 20 years, a woman named Angela Carter. She had written my will, drafted my trust, and understood every detail of what I wanted. Brandon said Angela was more of a general attorney, and that situations like this required a specialist. I told him I would think about it. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before picking up the phone and calling Angela myself to tell her exactly what Brandon had suggested. She stayed quiet for a moment and then said, "Arthur, I want you to listen carefully. Do not sign anything without speaking to me first. Not a power of attorney, not a transfer deed, not even a simple gift letter, nothing." I told her I understood. Later that evening, I told Margaret everything. She cried quietly for about 10 minutes. Then she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and said softly, "I always knew, Arthur. Deep down, I always knew." Over the next several months, the pressure slowly increased, the way pressure always builds when someone believes they're being clever and patient and thinks they're the smartest person in the room. Lily began calling more often. She started visiting on weekends she had never bothered visiting before. She brought expensive bottles of wine and bouquets of flowers for Margaret, acting like the loving daughter who could still make your throat tighten because you remembered when she had truly been that daughter, long before Brandon, before the hunger took hold. She talked about how worried she was about us getting older. She talked about how difficult it must be to maintain such a large property by ourselves. She spoke about how much she wished she could help more. Brandon, on the other hand, talked about numbers. He had a way of presenting figures that could make your own home sound like a financial burden. Property taxes, maintenance costs, heating expenses for a 4-bedroom house when you're living on a fixed income. More than once he mentioned that if the property were transferred now, while Margaret and I were still alive and healthy, the family could save a significant amount of money. He always said, "the family," though it was perfectly clear he really meant himself. Margaret's health had been slowly declining since the previous spring. Nothing dramatic. Her cardiologist described it as manageable, which is the word doctors tend to use when they want to be honest, without sounding alarming. She tired more easily than she used to. The cold seemed to bother her constantly. I had gradually taken over more of the daily responsibilities, grocery runs, yard work, and other chores she once handled without effort, but now found draining. I believe Brandon noticed the change. I believe he saw Margaret's condition as an opportunity. The meeting happened on a Saturday near the end of January, the coldest Saturday of the entire winter. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the bare birch trees in the yard looked like thin bones against a pale white sky. Lily and Brandon arrived together carrying a folder of documents and wearing the sort of serious, concerned expressions people rehearse in front of mirrors. They sat at my kitchen table, the table I had built myself from a single slab of black walnut, and Brandon carefully spread the paperwork across it before beginning his explanation. The document was a deed transfer. It would move full ownership of the property to Lily, with a life estate clause that would supposedly allow Margaret and me to remain in the house until we passed away. Brandon explained everything the way he explained most things, smoothly, confidently, adding just enough technical language to make questioning him feel like a sign of ignorance. I read every single line, slowly, carefully. I could see Brandon's jaw tighten slightly each time I turned another page. When I finished, I set the papers down and looked directly at my daughter. "Lily," I said calmly, "a life estate can be revoked by the deed holder under certain circumstances. Were you aware of that?" She glanced at Brandon. Brandon stared down at the table. "I'm not signing this," I said. That was when the mask finally began to slip. Not instantly. It peeled away gradually, like old wallpaper loosening in a damp room, exposing something darker beneath the surface. Brandon said I was being irrational, that my stubbornness was costing the family hundreds of thousands of dollars. He argued that Margaret's health made it irresponsible not to plan ahead. Lily insisted they were only trying to help, that I had never trusted her, that situations like this were exactly what destroyed families. I simply said, very calmly, that perhaps everyone should go home and sleep on it. What happened next was something I had not anticipated. I've replayed that moment many times in the months since, trying to pinpoint exactly when I should have realized what was coming, every time I reached the same conclusion. I should have recognized it the instant Brandon stood up from the table and his eyes drifted toward the door of the wine cellar. He knew about the cellar. He had been down there before, more than once, choosing bottles for dinner with the casual confidence of someone who already felt entitled to the place. He knew about the heavy oak door. He knew about the exterior bolt. What he didn't know, what no one knew except me and Angela, was what lay behind the false wall at the far end of the cellar. I had built it into the house back in 1988, the year after we moved in. At the time, I had been reading a lot about asset protection and thinking carefully about the future. I was an engineer. I always thought in terms of structures, systems, and supports designed to last long after the builder was gone. So I built a concealed compartment behind part of the stone veneer along the back wall, 22 inches wide and 14 inches deep, sealed with a carefully fitted stone panel that sat perfectly flush with the wall and was held in place by a small internal latch. Inside that hidden cavity, I placed a fireproof document box. Over the years, I updated its contents several times. By January of this year, the box held a certified copy of my complete will and trust documents, a recorded copy of the property deed showing the land placed in an irrevocable trust, a trust Angela and I had quietly restructured 18 months earlier after I began to understand Brandon's intentions, and a letter from Angela explaining in plain language that the property could not be transferred, sold, or seized without violating the trust agreement, which would automatically trigger a legal challenge. 6 months earlier, I had also added something else to the box. A prepaid burner phone, fully charged and sealed in a waterproof sleeve. I had never told Margaret about any of it, not because I wanted to hide anything from her, but because if the moment ever came, I wanted to hand her something real. Not just a plan described in theory, but a box she could hold, a phone already ready to call for help. After I refused to sign the documents, Lily excused herself to the bathroom while Brandon stepped into the hallway and made several calls. I could hear his voice, low and clipped. Margaret and I stayed at the kitchen table and finished the last of the coffee without saying much. After 40 years together, you learn that some silences are more truthful than words. When Lily returned, her expression had changed. It had hardened. She asked if Margaret and I would like to go down to the cellar and choose a bottle of wine. A peace offering, she said, smiling in a way that never quite reached her eyes. Margaret agreed before I could respond. She was cold, and she wanted to smooth things over. Even now, after everything, she still believes people can choose better than their worst instincts. It's one of the things I've loved most about her, and quietly worried about for 41 years. So the four of us walked down into the cellar together. I selected a bottle of Côte de Nuit I had been saving and turned to hand it to Lily. That was when Brandon stepped back toward the door. No, that's not quite accurate. Precision matters, and I have replayed this moment too many times to get it wrong. Brandon was the last person through the doorway. Instead of staying inside, he stepped back out into the kitchen just as Margaret and I moved toward the racks. Then I heard the bolt slide shut from the outside. I turned around. The door was closed. The bolt was set. Brandon's voice came through the thick wood, muffled, but clear. The house is ours now, Arthur. Lily's name is on the deed transfer, and we've got a notary scheduled Monday morning. You can cooperate, or you can spend the weekend down there. Your choice. I heard Lily say something I couldn't quite make out. Then their footsteps faded away. Margaret grabbed my arm. The cellar had gone completely dark. The single overhead bulb had been switched off from the panel upstairs. Her grip was fierce, the grip of someone frightened but determined not to show it. I spoke quietly. Margaret, listen to me. They made a mistake. It's freezing, she whispered, and I don't have my medication. I know, I said. Give me 4 minutes. I crossed the cellar in the darkness with the confidence of a man who had built every inch of it himself. I knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the back wall. I knew exactly where the stone panel was and the precise pressure needed to release the hidden latch. I had tested it twice in the past year, once alone, once with my eyes closed. The panel opened on the 3rd try. Inside, I found the document box. Beneath it was the phone. I switched on the phone's flashlight first. Margaret made a sound I had never heard from her before, something halfway between relief and disbelief. I lifted the light so she could see the box, then opened it and spread Angela's letter across the wine rack. She read it slowly in the thin, cold light. When she finished, she looked up at me, her eyes bright. "They can't take the house," I said quietly. "The trust makes the transfer invalid, but first, I need to make 2 calls." The first call was to Angela. She answered on the second ring, because the night before, after Brandon's strange silence in the hallway, I had already warned her that the following day might bring trouble and asked her to keep her phone nearby. She told me she had already prepared emergency injunction paperwork. She said the notary scheduled for Monday morning would find a cease and desist order waiting for him. Then she told me to call 911, so I made the second call. I told the dispatcher as calmly as possible that my wife and I had been locked inside our own basement by our daughter and son-in-law, who were attempting to fraudulently transfer our property. I explained that my wife had a heart condition and needed her medication, and that we required both a police officer and an ambulance at our address. The dispatcher asked if we were safe at the moment. I looked over at Margaret, who was sitting on a wooden crate with the document box resting in her lap, reading Angela's letter again with the expression of someone who has just been given back something she believed was already lost. I said, "Yes, we're safe, but please hurry. It's very cold." The police arrived 14 minutes later. I know the exact time because I watched the seconds ticking on the phone screen, counting them. Not out of panic, but out of the quiet habit of a man who spent his entire career measuring time, weight, and tolerance in precise fractions. We heard the knock at the front door. Then Brandon's voice. Then the officer asking if he could come inside. There was a short pause. After that, footsteps crossed the kitchen floor, the bolt slid back, and suddenly, light poured down the cellar staircase like something out of a painting. A young officer stood there with a flashlight. As he looked down at us, at Margaret's pale face, the freezing room, and the document box in my hands, his expression shifted from professional calm to something closer to anger. "Sir, are you Arthur Whitmore?" he asked. I told him I was. "Can you come upstairs, please? And ma'am, the paramedics are right outside." I won't pretend that the next few hours were simple, because they weren't. Margaret was taken to the hospital. The cold and the stress had caused her blood pressure to spike, so the doctors kept her for observation for 2 nights. The cardiologist later assured me she would be fine. I stayed behind at the house and gave statements to 2 different officers, and later to a detective who arrived around 9 that evening with a yellow legal pad and very patient eyes. Brandon was arrested that same night on charges of unlawful restraint and attempted real estate fraud. Lily was brought in for questioning and later released, but she was named in the civil complaint Angela filed early Monday morning, before the notary had even finished his first cup of coffee. The injunction was granted. The fraudulent deed transfer Brandon had apparently prepared in advance, complete with a forged version of my signature, was immediately voided. The irrevocable trust held exactly the way Angela had designed it to hold. That night, after everyone had finally left, I sat alone in my kitchen, the house I had built with my own hands, with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I looked at the black walnut table I had crafted from a single slab of wood, and I felt something difficult to describe. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't anger. It felt more like the quiet satisfaction of a structure carrying weight exactly the way it was designed to. But I want to be honest about something else too, because the grief is real, and I won't pretend otherwise. Lily is still my daughter. I held her the day she was born. There's a photograph on the mantel of her at 6 years old, missing both front teeth, laughing at something I said that I can't even remember anymore. That photograph hasn't moved from the mantel, and it never will. Whatever she became, whatever Brandon helped turn her into, or whatever she chose to become on her own, she was also that 6-year-old child laughing in my kitchen. Both of those things are true, and I carry both of them with me. Margaret forgives more easily than I do. 3 weeks after everything happened, she wrote Lily a letter. She didn't ask me to read it, and I didn't ask what it said. I only know that Lily didn't write back, at least not during the first 2 months. And I know that silence broke something inside Margaret that no cardiologist can measure or treat. But there is something else I know as well. Margaret came home from the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon in late February. I had the fireplace burning and a pot of soup simmering on the stove. The sunroom was filled. with that late winter light that slips through the south-facing windows in a way that always makes her stop for a moment when she walks in. She stepped into the room and did exactly that, stood still. She looked around at the room she had painted herself back in 1987, at the furniture we had chosen together, and at the 2.5 acres of cold Connecticut winter stretching beyond the glass, bare, quiet, and still completely ours. Finally, she said, "You knew this was coming." I told her, "I hoped I was wrong." She asked, "How long ago did you build that wall?" I answered, 1988. She stayed quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "You built this whole house, and inside it you built us a way out." I didn't really have an answer to that. I simply brought her the soup and sat beside her in the light, and we shared the kind of silence that only happens between two people who have survived something together and, against the odds, are still sitting in the same room. There is one more thing I want to say, because everyone who hears this story, and people have heard it, the way stories travel through small Connecticut towns, always asks the same question. They ask why I never told Margaret about the hidden wall, the phone, or the changes to the trust. They ask whether it bothered her that I kept those things from her. I told Margaret the truth. I built that wall, stocked that box, charged that phone, and called Angela because I'm an engineer. Engineers don't build structures hoping they never fail. Engineers build structures so they won't fail. I prepared for a disaster I prayed would never come. I kept it from Margaret not because I doubted her, but because I didn't want her to spend a single day of her life bracing for a collapse that might never happen. She thought about that for a long while. Then she told me she understood, but in the future, she would rather know. I told her there wouldn't be a next time. She smiled a little and said, "I know, but still." So now we have a new arrangement. Every document, every contingency, every copy of every important record, Margaret knows where all of it is. One Sunday afternoon in March, we spread everything out across that same black walnut table. Angela's files, the deed, the trust papers, and the updated will. The new will includes a clear and detailed exclusion of Lily and Brandon from any inheritance, along with a substantial donation to a local organization that helps older adults deal with elder abuse and financial exploitation. When I told Angela what I wanted to do with the donation, she said she had never had a client respond to attempted robbery by immediately funding a charity. I told her that was probably because most of her clients hadn't spent their careers building things meant to outlast the threats against them. She laughed. She's a good attorney. More importantly, she's the kind of person who answers the phone on the second ring when it matters. The house is still standing. That may be the most important sentence in this entire story. Most mornings, I walk through it before Margaret wakes up, through the sunroom, down to the basement, back up through the kitchen, and out onto the back porch where I look across the acres no one managed to take from us. It's partly ritual, partly habit, a builder's instinct. I trust nothing completely until I check it myself and confirm the structure is still sound. It always is. Then I go back inside, start the coffee, and listen to the house settling the way old houses do, creaking softly, sighing, adjusting to the cold or the warmth, making the quiet sounds of something lived in and cared for. Sometimes I think about all the people who have sat in this kitchen, at this table, in these chairs. I think about the little girl who once laughed here with no front teeth, and the woman Brandon helped shape her into. Both versions exist, and I have to live with that. I think about Margaret's hands gripping my arm in the darkness that night, cold and fierce, asking a question she never spoke aloud. And I think about what it truly means to build something that holds. Real security isn't a locked door. I know that better than most. Real security is everything you put in place before the door is ever locked. The planning, the preparation, the quiet determination to protect what matters before someone decides your life is just another asset waiting to be taken. Real security is a phone hidden inside a wall that only you know about, charged and ready, because you loved your wife enough to think 3 steps ahead. They believed they could take this house. They forgot one simple thing. I built it. And everything I build to last.